Okay, so we're going to enter into directly Odysseus and the episode of the sirens from, I think it's chapter uh, 12 in the Odyssey. So we'll do a little bit more about the Odyssey as a book in a few moments. I want to hit one thing before we get into this. So um, one of the things that happens here is that Adorno and Horkheimer claim that Odysseus is the prototype of the bourgeois subject, the prototype of the post-enlightened subject, right? And that and they so much of what they're doing here is trying to give definition to Odysseus in a way that allows him to become the beginning point for the dialectical development all the way up to the administrator of their time. Kind of odd. So the core of it is this idea of self-preserving. So in the world we're looking at here, the Enlightenment subject, right? The subject of enlightenment has had their world disenchanted. So the old gods, the old demons, the old rituals are gone. The old ends are no longer in view. They're gone. They were a lie. They were deceptive. And instead, you have all of this powerful new technology, right, of social and nature control, and but you don't really have a clear end. And so the end of life for the enlightened subject, at least in the first instance, is self-preservation. And this comes up over and over and over again in the next, 100 pages. The enlightened subject is a subject of self-preservation. This really got to me. I didn't like it. It didn't seem to make sense to me. But I think all it means is that, again, you have purposiveness without a real purpose, and all you're trying to do is preserve yourself. So Odysseus, in the last instance, is a kind of funny sort of hero when you get right down to it. Right, he goes through all these adventures, 13 encounters with gods and demons and so on. But in the end, he does very little that actually counts as like a sacrifice, or very little that would count as kind of um, altruistic, loving care for anyone. He's a very selfish guy who's pretty much interested in his own self preservation, getting himself back to the bed of Penelope, who he doesn't really care about that much anyway, but back to Ithaca, where he's going to basically kick the suitors of his wife back into place and resume his position as the lord of the Ithacal manor, I guess, right? So his end is one of self-preservation. So the enlightened subject is one who's organized, who self-organizes around that idea of holding the ego together. And you'll find it's like page 26. So humanity had to inflict terrible injuries on itself for the self, the self-identical, purpose-directed, masculine character of human beings was created, and then the process is repeated in every childhood. The blind determination to preserve the self, the ego, right? Right? So trying to avoid self annihilation, uh, yeah, keeping the self going. So this becomes like the core of everything, is to keep the self going. So the new myth is essentially whatever that myth is, en route to the myth is self-preservation, right? So you're not serving the old gods, the old demons, the old social order, the cultists of that existed before. In fact, you're probably using that cultist and using those old gods and demons and belief in them to advance your own self-purpose. And this is true all the way through to the administrators of the concentration camps in under the Nazis. Okay, that each phase of the development then of capital under the enlightened spirit, each moment of bourgeois enlightenment, again, continually enhances that power of self preservation, self determination, but often by eliminating the self of others, right? Totalized instrumental power to keep oneself and one's way of life together. Okay, so that is where this goes. So, yeah, let's see here on on page 25. I just added here. Um, on page 25, uh, yeah, there's Yeah, they Odysseus invents the idea of losing oneself in the past. Yeah, that's what goes. Okay, so here's the image of the sirens, which I think I have right here. Okay, so Odysseus is towards the end of his travels, and you know the famous account of this, right? So the sirens are these mythic beings who sing an irresistible song. Circe, the enchantress, or um, who in whose grasp Odysseus had spent a year, right, warned him of 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 the sirens and encouraged, in fact, gave him the stratagem to get out. So he was enlightened about the and forewarned about the future hazard he faced, and was also given the technique, the technology, the know-how, right? And it wasn't by praying. He didn't pray. He shoved wax in the ears of the men doing the rowing. Okay? All right. So this is the famous scene. So Odysseus, following Circe's advice, has himself tied to the mast of the ship, while the men whose ears have been stopped with wax and therefore cannot hear the allure of the song, music here, by the way, this is very interesting. This has a musical quality to it, given Adorno's interest in music, but they can't hear the song. And so they row past, and no matter, even though he wants to stop and he gets all excited and all that kind of stuff, he just has to get rowed past. And apparently, as Adorno's and Horkheimer say, one of the sirens dies, or they all die, because they failed to seduce these men. So, what was the song? I think Adorno overplays it here, but at any rate, here's what he claims. His claim is that what the sirens are singing is a song of memory, a song of the past, a song of your own deeds and of your own personal past. So they're singing the song of the Trojan War and Odysseus' deeds in it. And so the song basically is, linger here a while with us and we'll sing about your past. And you can reminisce, get lost in your own past. So the past becomes alive again. And in enlightenment, the old gods, the old ways, the old rituals die, they go away, they're disenchanted, and the past itself goes away. Prior to enlightenment, in the world of pure myth, right, you're engaged in a kind of circular motion, a recreation of the always already was, that's what tradition is, and you're engaged in this cyclical action to keep the past present in time. But enlightenment goes the other way. You leave the past behind, right? And you're living in a present, a very, very thickened present, right? And where the future is just a future of sort of relevance. And the past, the only part of the past that matters, as Adorno and Horkheimer says, under enlightenment, is one where is only usable knowledge. Only usable knowledge is the only part of the past you carry with you into the future, right? Okay, so the past is a shade, it's gone. That's part about being enlightened, and that the sirens represent a re-emergence, at least in personal or cultural myth, a re-memory, a reminiscence of one's own past, which would be alluring. And so they got this idea then that by stopping the ears, the past is kept from intruding. And he's got this thing. So this is page 26 again. I want to read this. It goes on. I mean, you can read it yourself. It's actually a fairly decent retelling of the tale, but he's got this thing about how he listens at the mass. So the claim is, again, I don't like it. I don't buy it. He claims that there's a class divide here, so that the men who, so that the men who, I don't know what I just did with you see it? Here it is. Okay, well, I don't have it. Okay, so the men who are doing the rowing are the workers, and the man who's doing the listening, the appreciation, the aesthetic appreciation of the artful song, right, is Odysseus. So he's removed from the immediate embodied pleasure of uniting with the sirens, I suppose, and he's constrained in his response. But as long as he remains in this kind of fixity, where he kind of renounces the merger, as it were, with the sirens, and merely views the song as an object of aesthetic appreciation, art, he's okay. So he's got this thing, this kind of crazy thing. I don't like it, but that the rowers are workers, working class men, bourgeois, proletariat, basically slaves, I guess, and that Odysseus is the master, and that he's allowed the privilege of participating fully in the aesthetic experience of art, that he becomes a subject of the disenchanting, I guess, and the cultural side of the Enlightenment, and that he uses that knowledge, that power, that control, again, to keep these men in a position of of um, of joyless work, I guess is the only way to put it. I don't buy, for a bunch of reasons. One is that every man that was on that voyage with him wasn't working class. They each were nobles in their own right, who had volunteered to go into warcraft with him, had all been, lifelong practitioners of the knightly arts, and were along with him as kind of like Viking raiders, or a medieval raiding party, even where only the elite are going to be involved in this. Real slaves, real working class people, they're back home, shearing sheep. So I don't really like the account, but the differentiation is kind of interesting, right? Um, what I think is really interesting that I don't sure that they get quite right is that Circe, the enchantress, both this again enlightens in both senses, enlightens, warning them, telling them about what to see in the future, and also gives the technology to help the groups, in Odysseus self-preserve through this act. Okay, so yeah, so how did we do? Did we get pretty much through that? I think, yeah, yeah. Okay, so yeah, so the workers are transformed into mere practical, alert, on their toes beings who give themselves completely to work in the here and now. They lose work erotics. The experience of work and rowing loses any, erotic attraction or kind of aesthetic pleasure that's reserved for the master who gets that. And so there's a kind of extraction of surplus enjoyment in a kind of Zizek'ian sense or Lacanian sense, right? So work aesthetics is gone, work erotics is gone. So the workers get no aesthetics, the master gets aesthetic. So master gets aesthetics and no work, the workers get work and no aesthetics. Okay? And so that means instrumental reason, again, there's kind of been kind of a fracking of the outcome of enlightenment. And so that instrumental reason, all qualities are gone, meaning is gone, time is quantifiable now, that power is controlling both leisure and work time, elimination of all qualities, removal of the aesthetic into the mere position of art. So that's sort of the thing, is that there really isn't a qualitative distinction now between these people. Art itself isn't a really embodied experience, it's merely a leisure time activity that is, again, pressed away from full immediate experience. I think I'm going to give that up, but I'm just going to point on page 29 and 30. It says I should read it at length on totalitarianism and destructiveness. I'll probably do that. Yeah, here it is. So the instrument is becoming, under the commodity economy, the instrument is becoming autonomous, independent of the will of the rulers. The mediating agency of mind moderates the immediacy of economic injustice. The instruments of power, language, weapons, and finally machines, which are intended to hold everyone in their grasp, must in their turn be grasped by everyone. Okay? So the thing-like quality of the means, which makes them universally available and objectively valid for everyone, applies a criticism of the domination from which thought has arisen. I'm trying to go on here. Alienated reason is machinery. But it winds up here. And yeah. So the okay. Now that the livelihood of those still needed to operate the machines can be provided with the minimum part of the working time which the masses of society have at their disposal, their superfluous remainder, the overwhelming mass of the population, are trained as additional guards of the system. I really like this. This actually fits like a key into one of my main arguments in a book I'm working on. Right, is that that essentially there's two forms of social energy, productive and destructive, and that capitalism has a way to maximize the productivity of labor, and that the labors that can't be absorbed, the human energy that isn't absorbed into the production apparatus, is available for something else, and that something else can be destruction. So it can be, protest, warfare, and what have you. And here, again, so what the system does, it doesn't just use the labor for production, it uses superfluous labor as guards of the system. So instead of allowing the workers who can't work to attack the owners, instead, the workers who can't work and aren't working are authorized to become guards of the system, right? And so there you go. So that they can be used today and tomorrow as material for its grand designs. Kept alive as an army of the unemployed, the reduction to mere odds for administration, and goes on. And so again, this is extraordinarily close to Marx. It's actually close to Durkheim in many passages as well. But there you go. Okay. All right. Yeah. So there we are. I think with that, I'll stop again, and we'll pick it up at the excursus. Okay, it clearly is time to get into the actual chapter on Odysseus, the excursus on Odysseus. So again, this begins on page 36 of the book, or 35 of the book, right here. And yeah, so again, he begins by briefly recounting the story of the sirens again and the points that he was making there, and then keeps going on from there. So let's see if we can't briefly talk about what the Odyssey is. So I had to rebuy a copy of the Odyssey. I had one in grad school that I absolutely loved that wound up disappearing on me in a variety of moves. I like the language in that version better. I've got the Fitzgerald version that I reread for this. So really fast. So this is Homer's second epic poem, with the Iliad being the first, which is the account of the Helen of Troy's abduction and the Trojan War, right? And so this book really takes place in the aftermath of the Trojan War, as Odysseus, the hero of Ithaca, and his fellow travelers, his companions, have not returned from war. They've been gone for years, and there's trouble at home. So it's really about. I mean, it's the weirdest thing, really. It's an epic poem about a man trying to get home. That's it, And what's funny is that all these 19th century and 20th century adaptations always emphasize the love, that what he really wants to do is get home to his one true love, Penelope. He just can't wait, like some sort of country song, right? Country music song that, his dog is there, his pickup truck is there, and his good old woman is waiting for him if he can just get back home. It isn't that. He really, I don't think there's a moment in the book when Odysseus actually says, I really miss my fine Penelope and can't wait to get back. It's primarily to get back into his position of domination on the land, as we're going to try to get to in a bit. So it's a long book. It's about 500 pages in printed form today with fairly close text. It's told in 24 books. It's divided up into 24 books or chapters. The first four are what are called the Telemachy, I guess, Telemachy. It's about Telemachus, his son, more than anything else. We're going to leave that aside. It's kind of a, you're brought into the story in the middle, put it that way. Books 5 through 8 are the moments when we actually meet Odysseus for the first time. We find him on delayed in the arms of Calypso, the enchantress, right? Or Calypso, the goddess, who's his lover, who seduced him and kept him for 7 years. And then he winds up escaping there. Eventually, she lets him go and winds up in a place with the Phaeacians, I think is how you pronounce it, the Phaeacians. Kind of a civilized group who he reveals himself to them eventually by first winning a whole bunch of athletic contests. And then, but he shows up on their shore naked, all of his companions dead, doesn't have a thing, not even a stitch of clothes, doesn't have his boat, doesn't have anything, right? Barely has his name in his story. But books 9 through 12 then are they're really weird. Odysseus becomes the poet. So I had this sense of like someone playing a lyre in the background or a lute or something, and having him, beller away singing the epic poem of his own adventures. This goes on for 4 chapters. So most of what we think is in Homer's voice. In Homer's telling is actually a first-person narration coming out of Odysseus's mouth himself. So it's kind of interesting in that sense. There are 13 episodes, or 13 stops, or 13. It can get counted differently, but put it this way: Odysseus winds up in his own 4-chapter narration of his adventures, right? Going to 13 places for 13 reasons. 13 sort of labors. If there were the labors of Hercules, we have here the labors of Odysseus. And so they're arrayed in a kind of uh, a clear ordering, if that's the right way to put it. Chiasmus, is that how you pronounce it? Chiasmus? I don't even know how to pronounce this. I'm not a Greek scholar, but I love some of this stuff. But I guess the way to look at it is something like this, that the narration has a still point in the center that's not repeated, but every early encounter in the adventures is repeated a second time, never identically, which is what makes it kind of modern. In fact, I think this has a fugue structure to it. So you have a kind of a return of the repressed. There's a constant repetition, but it's never a complete mythical return. It's always variations on a theme, and it flies. It literally takes flight. That's one of the phrases that's used. This is about, as Adorno says, Odysseus is taking flight from the land of myth and trying to get back to his own self-preservation. He's an Enlightenment subject in that sense. But these are 2 east and west pediments, the Temple of Apollo, that show again a kind of reversal, right? So there's symmetry, a still point in the center, and then a kind of self-reversing symmetry. It's called the Abba structure, ABBA, the Abba structure, right? There's other technical terms for it as well, but this apparently is very widespread in. Here's the Temple of Zeus, has the same kind of thing on it. And this is so widespread. I find it interesting. I kind of I can get lost in this stuff. I just find it interesting how much the symmetry, that there's a kind of unconscious structure to the artwork and the epic poetry of the Greek world. That's just astonishing to me. That gets lost until you kind of get inside of it. Like my first times reading it, I didn't pick it up, and then here it shows up. So so there's reversals that take place. Now there's a man named Cedric Whitman who wrote a book in 1959 called Homer and the Age of Heroes, or something like that. Right? I've got it here. Homer and the 1958, Homer and the Heroic Tradition. And this is a chapter on Homer and geometric art. I love this. He claims that the narration, that Odysseus's narration of his adventures is essentially, he calls it an onion skin at one part, or a self-reversing narration. And he claims it's the exact thing that you would find on vases, and vase paintings from the same period of time. And that, let me see if I can find the one I like the most here. Yes, this one. So this is the rim of a symposium drinking glass. We should use this at our symposium. But along the rim of the symposium, I think I think this is 12 different scenes from Greek mythology and epic poetry. And no matter where you start, there's symmetry. But it's kind of self-reversing. So let's say we start here. I'm trying to find the exact what do I recognize right off here? The killing of the Gorgon. Where's that at? No, well, anyway, we'll just start with this moment here. So you have this scene, and as you move out, you have horses on each side, but they're reversed, right, facing each other. And then you get farther away, and you get a group of people fighting here and a group of people fighting there. Again, it's repetition, it's symmetry, but it isn't identical. It's always variations on a theme. It's a fugue-like structure rather than something else. Anyway, you can go around the entire drinking cup. and with a kind of with a constant repetition, symmetry, but difference. There's always difference, right? Sometimes it's balanced opposites, right, to show opposition, to give definition to things, that kind of stuff, to show additional nuance. Anyway, I think it's very interesting how this happens. So I've got, it's really fast. Here's some Greek artwork. This is from the Attic, the Attic Analatos vase, right? And so there's this artist, and Cedric Whitman thinks this vase was created at the same time that Homer's Odyssey was written down, and he claims that that earlier forms of Greek art that are much more geometric are only about 100 years earlier, and he thinks that like the Iliad, Homer's Iliad, was created around this structure. And he's got this argument. I'm just going to give it to you real fast. He argues that if you look here, you see forms, very abstract geometric forms, identifiable, but forms that are repeated almost in a geometric style, right? It's a funeral pyre. There's probably a grieving widow, little kids, and that kind of stuff. Some horses for some reason. But you got this repetition, right? The geometric form of the legs and so on. So, and when you get to the vase that is associated with the Odyssey, you still have geometric form, but there's a central scene and an important scene, and there's often again symmetry. As you go around the vase, there's symmetry, but there's a central organizing theme, and the structure is almost like a framing device around it, right? Central scene with frames around it of symmetry and asymmetry. I find this stuff so interesting. Anyway, so this is contemporary art to the time of the Odyssey, and this is contemporary art to the time of the Iliad. And what Whitman says is really interesting. In the Iliad, there are a whole series of soldiers who die in the Trojan War who are named, and it's almost like moments in the Iliad that would be like you going to the Vietnam Memorial in Washington D.C. and reading off the names of the dead soldiers there. You're recognizing them, right, and even naming them. So they're being imprinted, recorded, memorialized in name only. So they're anonymous in all but name, but they do appear, and it's just like these rows of soldiers. So Whitman looks at this image and links it to that sequence in the Iliad of the anonymous, named, but otherwise unknown soldiers, just lined up. What's interesting about the 700 and some odd people who die in the Odyssey, only 2 of them are named. So Odysseus survives, and then he has one. God, I got to give the guy's name. There's only 2 that are named. One of is Epenor, who survives. Who gets killed right at the middle point of the book, and it's kind of important. None of the rest are named. Not even given a name. Not given any kind of identity. They get turned into pigs and stuff, but they're still not given names. And so there's a central scene, a central character, a central sort of much more psychological depth and so on. But the symmetry is a structuring device around it. So I think that's really interesting. Okay, so when you get into the middle, so there's Elpenor right here, the one of the 2 men named in his crew. So he starts relating. So you're halfway through the book before he even begins to relate a single heroic adventure. And then they come in rapid succession. So it starts with this kind of odd raid upon the Kikones. I don't know how to pronounce it. We'll just say it's Kikones. I like it that way. Where they rape and pillage and loot the village. And then they wind up getting a military response. Kills 72 of the men in Odysseus' crew. They get away from there. They wind up in the land of the Lotus Eaters, right? More on that as we go. Then they wind up in the land of the Cyclops, where Polyphemus, the great Cyclops enemy, kills and eats 6 of his men. They get off that. They wind up at Aeolus's island. He's the Wind King, or the god of wind, who helps him. They wind up messing that up for a variety of reasons. They wind up in the land of the Laestrygonians. We're going to say that. And where 11 out of 12 of the ships are destroyed in a brutal raid. Okay, so most of Odysseus's men, even the names of the ships aren't known. We just know that there were 11 of them destroyed. Okay. Then you get and this is in chapter 10, then you get to the account of Circe, the enchantress, the one who turns people into pigs and so on. He winds up spending a year with her. His servant Elpenor dies there. Then the seventh adventure is the descent into hell, Hades, right? And that's in chapter 11. And that, to me, even though he's descending into darkness, that's the moment of enlightenment. And it really is at that point, that's the midpoint. That's the point, that's the peak of the narration. And after that, events unfold differently. So he learns of his fate, he learns of his future, he learns of what's going on at his home, he gets enlightened, and then he also is given quite a bit of technology, really, at least in the sense of foreknowledge and forewarning about what's going to happen. Some of it comes from meeting, people from his past and so on, but a lot of it comes by going back to the island of Circe, where she kind of gives him some advice, right? So then you wind up. So he leaves Hades, goes back to Circe's island, buries Elpenor, who he saw in hell. So he died right before he went to Hades. They go back, bury his body, and then he gets all this advice from Circe. That's the eighth adventure. Ninth is the sirens that we already talked about, the famous incident of the sirens. And they get through that, and then there's the encounter with the monster Scylla, who winds up eating 6 of his men. They survive that. They wind up landing at the island of, I think it's Thrinakia, where they eat, and again, I don't know how to pronounce this stuff. I've only read it. I have no idea how the words are pronounced. But they eat Helios's cattle, and then Helios gets outraged. Zeus attacks the ship with a thunderbolt, and everybody except Odysseus dies, right? And then he winds up on just, I think it's the rudder post and part of his boom or something like that he ties together with a shroud, and he floats past Charybdis, another sea monster, nearly dies there, winds up hanging over this hellmouth, quite honestly. That's the 12th adventure, then winds up washing up on Calypso's island, right, where he winds up an inmate there for about 7 years. So those are the adventures of Odysseus, and he winds up telling those in his own voice while singing to a lute to companions on the island. And that's it. To me, that's basically the story. A lot of people like the more romantic stuff. After that is over, books 13 through what do we got here? Books 13 through 22 are the return to Ithaca, the killing of the suitors of his wife, kind of a big bloodbath that Odysseus that gets written about. There's the scene of the marriage bed. They make a big deal of that. And then finally a reconciliation with his father, the return to Big Daddy. He gets recognized by the big other, the feud that it was launched gets solved, and so on. So anyway, there's all kinds of doubles in this story. None of this gets mentioned by Horkheimer and Adorno, but I think it's interesting. There are 2 sorceresses, 2 goddesses that are lovers of Odysseus and that delay him, Calypso and Circe. There are 2 cannibals. There's the Cyclops and then the Lastrygonians. There are 2 voyages past Scylla and Charybdis. There are 2 elemental gods of wind and sun, right, that get pissed off and he has to deal with. There's 2 intoxicating sort of scenarios, right? You've got the sirens and the lotus eaters, or the lotus leaves. There's 2 Elpenor episodes. There's all kinds of these repetitions. So the idea is that there's a structure to it. Now this is important to me because one of the arguments that Adorno and Horkheimer make is that there is a kind of a deep structure, a unifying logic and a deep structure to social reality. The social nature, such as it is something that is inherently patterned, that there's a total, and that as we've gone, it started out as myth, right? We got enlightened, then you get myth, and you get these sort of split-offs and the antinomy, anyway, the divisions within the Enlightenment that increase social control. And you wind up in the 1940s in California, refugees, while millions are being executed and a world war rages. And because the system has worked its way up to a point where it's total. and where capitalism is more or less total, where the logic of capital is more or less total, where the class relations are more or less total, where even the working classes are penetrated with the logic of the system, where there's one logic, there's one unifying logic, right? There's one unitary way to organize the world, and that whatever reason there is that has, high levels of generalization, low levels of individuality, medium levels of particularity, they're all united with a schema of identity and uniformity along the dimension of the logic. Okay, and the logic of our time is the logic of capital, and the accumulation of surplus value and so on, in a totalizing way without regard to the ends of human life. That it's all means, no ends. It's fully instrumental reason and no end reason. So if the Enlightenment seemed like the moment when a Frenchman would take up turtlenecks and cigarettes and sit around and debate the ends of life, oh, c'est la vie, what shall we do, right? That, whatever it would be, right? That ain't it. That was one moment of the Enlightenment. But in the last instance, again, by the 1940s, when the slaughter is taking place, the logic of the Enlightenment, instrumental reason, had become totalized. And that the whole world then was being again was brought into consistency along that unifying logic. And so when we look at these structural arrangements within the Odyssey itself, the entire thing is organized according to a kind of like a unifying logic. There is an author, there is a poet who's actually taking each of these 13 instances of myth, which is really kind of what I wanted to make with that. So these are like 13 mythic episodes, right? And then stitching them together into something like a coherent narrative. With that, I'll stop and we'll come right back.